Complicated people are not black and white chess pieces for political parties to instrumentalize for their own grand plan of what the Democratic or the Republican Party will look in the future. These people are complex human beings, and in this polarized, dysfunctional political atmosphere where no political party is actually producing effective, sensible policy, we think that the people have been abandoned. So a few pieces of model before we move on, right? There are 4 things under this. Firstly, is that we will ban political parties, and political parties in this case are defined as political factions where there are politicians in power that define whether a candidate selection process or who will run in a certain constituent. This is what a political party means. If you don't violate it or you don't abide by this policy, we will fine you, we will jail you, we will find ways to make you listen to the government. Secondly, is that you can still apply as an independent, right? So this means that if you have a certain number of votes, you will be put on the ballot and you will be allowed in power. Thirdly, is that we support an alternative voting process where you can rank your preferences. So if this means that if your political candidate doesn't get into power, you can still be selected for your second choice candidate. This is the model that has already been adopted in numerous European countries, and we want to do this here as well. So fourth and finally is that there will be independent organizations. So for example, in Mexico, the Election Commission, which will supply information about all the existing candidates. We think this has already been done in the past. This will curb significantly many of the problems about having too many politicians. We think this is where we're able to resolve for all this. And all that we're doing here is for 3 main goals. Firstly, is that we want to make people feel represented, right? We want to resolve the current fact that people think that politics is just a bunch of rich people doing their own thing. Secondly, we want to decrease polarization. And thirdly, we want to produce functional policies where you actually create policies and don't just argue around. I'll forward 3 arguments in this speech. Firstly, on the principle of representation. Secondly, on polarization in terms of the administration itself. And third and finally, on polarization in terms of the campaigning process and what individuals think on the ground. Firstly, on the principle, because assumption in a democracy is that everyone votes out of their own individual interests, right? But the reality is that their choices are extremely limited. So this means that their choices don't often represent what exactly you want. It doesn't represent everyone. This is due to 3 different reasons. The first reason is that the party stance is often collectivized very randomly. Like if you think about what you associate with the Democratic Party in the United States or Republican Party, all of this is due to very arbitrary historical factors. For example, the reason we think that the Democratic Party is aligned with racial justice or the black vote is simply because Lyndon B. Johnson made race a partisan issue by passing the Civil Rights Amendment. The only reason we think the Republicans are associated with pro-life radicals is because Ronald Reagan captured the evangelical Christian vote. But there's no reason why you can't support racial equality but still support a small government, right? There's no reason why those shouldn't be the same thing. The second reason is that there are also many contradictions even within a single political party's ideology. So for example, there can still be Republicans who believe in a small government but also pro-life policies where there is an extension of government control. This also means that people can often don't trust authority, but at the same time, they can also support cops. The third reason is that people are often extremely complicated, right? So this means they can be a Christian, but you can also be an ethnic minority. You can be gay, but you can also be extremely traditional and rich. But the problem is that parties attempt to represent the entire spectrum of human beings, even when there are only 2 parties. So I'll take you right after this. So you have to fall within a single party line to have any kind of representation. And this means that candidates also often suppress their own opinions when they're running for office because you have to represent the possibility of representing everyone within a single political spectrum when that political spectrum is half of the entire country. We think this is where individuals don't vote for the best president, they vote for the least bad one. I'll take your point now.
Because people are so diverse and it's impossible to encapsulate all ideas under one single banner, are you allowing for independent individuals to lend your platforms to other independents so one of them can gain the majority vote?
No, we're perfectly happy with having that happen, right? If this occurs, that's a natural part of politics. At least at the very beginning, you had all the party ideas come out. We think this is where it is more possible for we have a national spectrum, even if in the end only one person is president. The reason why this principle is significant is that it means that you have to hide your political stance. So if you're a socially liberal, you can't support deregulation because then you seem like a capitalist pig, even though that may not be the case. You also have to vote for politicians who you don't fully believe in because there simply are no other alternatives. Second argument on why polarization exists within the functionality of a political administration when you're in power, when you're in Congress, when you're inside that particular branch of the government. This is due to 4 different reasons. Firstly, is that a member of parliament or a senator is expected as part of the social norm to abide by your party lines. Like, it's just a bad thing in general for you to be a political party in the United Kingdom and you don't vote according to your political party. Secondly, is that you need the party to put you on the ticket for the next term. So it's a question of yes or no, whether you're even a candidate inside the policies inside the next term. It's also a question of the Liberal Democrats Party or any other party in the United Kingdom being able to determine where and how you run. So if you are being seen as a person who doesn't really listen to the party or has different views or the party in general, you will be put as a sacrificial lamb inside some party that you can never, or inside some constituent that you can never hope to win. This is where you have to listen to the party and the views are all the same. The third reason is that political parties often run on a single manifesto, right? That's why Macron, Le Pen all had their own manifestos and everyone inside it is supposed to expect and abide by the same things. Fourth and finally is that you need to help the party look good, right? This is the premise of this fourth reason. It is because your name is bound and strapped together with the party. That is when you run as a member of parliament or as you run as a senator inside Ohio, your name is always tied to being a Democrat or to being a Republican. This means that all of your actions are partisan. So this means that everything that happens inside Congress or everything that happens inside the parliament, you will automatically be partisan. So as a Republican, you will always vote against Obama policies because you have to make your party look like you're the victorious one that has pushed down Obama and therefore pushed down the entirety of the Democrat Party. This means that everything inside politics is a game of tug and war where there is only winners and losers. This is where it is even more impossible for you to pass policies that are truly bipartisan. We suffer all this because since all of these are tied to the existence of parties, this means that we're able to solve for all these problems when parties no longer exist. And this is extremely important due to a couple of reasons. It's important, firstly, because then you have a genuine representation of opinions. It is secondly important because now you can actually pass sensible policies like environmental change now that you, as a party of the Republican Party, do not have to vote against an environmental policy simply because the oil companies funded Donald Trump. Now you're more able to pass policies that actually help the country. And thirdly, because people often feel trapped out of policies, especially in the United States or in other countries, where the views on politics is extremely cynical. And the only way by which you can gain this representation is through the existence of this. Third and finally, why is it the result of polarization in the campaign process or the people and individuals? We think this is due to three different reasons that polarization exists, which means that you don't vote for any other party except for one party that you always vote for. This is because one, party identification is often incredibly strong. So people often say, we will never vote Republican, or I will never vote for that bunch of Wall Street pigs, even though that might not be a good characterization. Therefore, this means that your choice of parties and your choice of politicians that you can vote for is extremely limited. The second reason is because with no parties, there is no conception of the opponent. With no party, there's always different individuals and different politicians who exist. There's no conception of my enemy is a Republican Party, or my enemy is Green Party, because everyone is on the field together. This is where you're better able to pass policies. Third is that there are often media changes, right? Because now Fox is not inherently tied to Republicans. Because now CNN isn't intrinsically tied to Democrats because they have a history of funding. This is where we have better campaigns in general because there is less of an emphasis on partisanship instead of the individual candidates. All this means that you are better able to have a more equal representation of views, or minority votes are no longer being ignored because they're taken for granted, or you're better able to ensure that you have more choice and people will dare to talk and express their opinions as politicians. We are very, very proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 21 seconds.
If all the judges are ready, can we have first opposition?
Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah. Okay, great. panel, I would really love to thank Team China for pointing out all of the contradictions in their own case and giving us the win from their first speech. We think that everything she said is the correct characterization as to why parties have harms, but there was no countermeasure as to how they would solve any of these circumstances under their side. I'm going to give direct refutation to the two things that broadly came up in first prop. First prop said two things broadly, one about representation and the other about polarization. So the first thing that first prop said that is that we don't represent everybody when we have structures of political parties. Notice the nuance that you represent even less people under their side when they aren't political parties. A political party, by their own definition, meaning a cultivation of two sides of a house, means that you at least get to galvanize and support half of a house. Under their side, where they support a relative majority, where 7% of individuals can give you the win as the president, we then tell you that 93% of people are subjugated under your side. You get individuals who do not support, who do not buy into your policies. They don't solve anything. They have to try to prove that in the next speech. Ronald Reagan capturing the Christian vote is still something very possible under our world. Don't verbalize your POI. In their world, you can still have individuals who are independents who can capture evangelical votes. That means that you can still capture fan bases and secure that same similar loyalty. Also, by her own explanation, if each individual is diverse, ultimately that means I don't want to concede my opinions to other people, especially when the system itself means that I no longer have to when I'm an independent. I think that, and then the final thing, right, about individuals being pigeonholed under their side. All of this compounded, the first and second argument of hers, is all taken down by the fact, after her response to our PY, that they would lend their support to other candidates, effectively meaning they would form coalitions in order to galvanize support with one another. Under that paradigm, I don't understand why all of the harms that they listed about political parties having to pigeonhole individuals, having to subjugate minorities, I don't understand why that wouldn't happen under their world as well, when you will want to go into a coalition of individuals who you believe to be stronger than yourself. Moving on, second argument that she presented to you, the idea about how partisanship and polarization. I think polarization is far worse under their side. If everybody is different, as you say, and politics requires the coalition of individuals to pass policies, to work in a chain of command, I think that by that definition, all individuals under your side are even more polarized. You don't want to work with other people, and the only way to differentiate yourself from another person is by slandering the other person, because why would I give in to my rival? Why would I pass that sort of policies? They have to realize that they are supporting nothing under their side. They have lost this debate because they have no case. Okay, let's go into substantive. No democracy is perfect, ladies and gentlemen. But this debate is about what is intrinsically beneficial to democracy, and we'll tell you that parties and the ability to galvanize things like resources to be able to galvanize voter base is one principally correct, but it is also something that allows better policy making. We say that is a game of puppeteering where you don't fight your principles. That is a game in which you fight for your own personality and you fight for individuals under their side. What counterfactual do we then support? We support a multi-party system. We support coalitions. We think there is an incentive to develop new kinds of parties and ideologies. So in countries like Germany and England, you have parties constantly rising like the Green Party and Tory Party after new ideologies rise in those states. We think parties have an incentive to cater to splintering and ultimately make new parties to represent those ideals. We will also support effective checks and balances. So we'll support things like defending the basic separation of powers and curbing things down on like gerrymandering. So we'll support things like politics being separate from the judiciary, and in that sort of sense where the judiciary can check and balance the executive and the legislative and maintain that separation of powers. We think that nothing China says is contentious if it is so intellectually dishonest. They cannot argue for fighting for coalitions because they supply all of the same harms that we want to bring to you on their side. What is so unique about a political party is ultimately the argument that we will bring forth to you today and why there are certain elements that are inalienable to a certain democracy. So I have two arguments to bring forth to you. First of all, about how we uphold the pillars of democracy, and the second about how we cripple the formation of the nation and democracy. So the ability to form political parties is intrinsic to democracy itself. So first layer of analysis. I think why our political parties formed in the first place is because of the fact that there was a need to be able to characterize your own goals in a means that collectivizes itself on a mass scale. So people with aligned ideas should be allowed to process those ideas in public. I think representatives have a principal right to collectivize for the greater good. So if there are a great many goals, the ability for people to fight for that goal is a sole tenet of democracy in of itself, to cultivate for the many for a greater purpose. So we point to you how things like unions by extension can never be cultivated under their side, because that is a shared goal that individuals make. So for example, the ex-president of Brazil, Lula, being able to overthrow an authoritarian government by rising up a group of workers' unions means that it is a form of democracy that we are willing to protect. We say that is the ability to collectivize individuals. But the second reason we tell you, second layer, is that we are able to bypass self-interest when you have the tenets of a party to follow. So me being part of the Democratic Party means that I have to follow many tenets that the Democratic Party has historically mandated under its side. So I separate my own self-interest, or rather, even if I don't want to, I am forced to separate my own self-interest for that greater good. I think that fulfills what the mass majority of people want. So even under our side, even if we subjugate the other half, we are at least able to cultivate half of the coin. We think things like structures of primaries, of having to do caucuses in public, all these things requiring different sides mean that ultimately we can get a middle ground that could be found under our work. Before I go on, I'll take a POI.
If the point of a political party is to collectivize people with similar political goals, doesn't it fail at the point in which those classifications alienate billions of people?
You are alienating billions of people. You are subjugating the other 93% of people. We have half the vote, or even if the party itself in the country is split into two camps, we don't alienate as many people as your side. Your side has to characterize that. Notice the worst case scenario on our side in terms of accountability is that we get people like Donald Trump in the party. On that worst case scenario, individuals like Donald Trump are still forced to have to bind to the tenets of the Republican Party and listen to the words of how other people in the party can check and balance him. Second thing, how it cripples the ability for legislation and democracy. The ability to pass legislation feasibly is very ruined when you have a constant infighting for that power in the first place. So in status quo, when you have different manifestos, it's already difficult to find a common ground. But under their world, there are a million minute differences in each manifesto that individuals ultimately have to come together for. Also, in terms of a voter base, you subjugate that voter base into splinters. If individuals are so diverse and you give that sort of platform, I struggle to see as to how you are able to represent a large majority of individuals. But also, there is no long-term change under their world. So if I am always in politics itself, individuals are subjugated to 4-year terms and 5-year terms. This means that I don't want to build for my next guy. I don't want to build for the party. Under our world, maintaining the name of the party is an incentive for you to build long-term infrastructure and long-term goals. The party itself enforces a continuity so that you are forced to be able to uphold the name of the party. This means schools. This means things like long-term infrastructure and things that are beneficial for the country because they are ultimately beneficial for the party. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, they have to defend the alienation of voters, the distrust of politicians when all their systems result in no infrastructure, no representation. We say let them fall, let's side with opposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 41 seconds.
Can the timekeeper slightly increase the volume so we can hear the mark?
All right. Noted.
If the judges are ready, can we invite second proposition to continue the case for prop?
Just to clarify, this is from first speaker Prop. Would the judges prefer that the POIs be verbalized or be written on a sheet of paper? Because I don't think we were clear on that until the last speech.
For me, verbal is better.
Sorry, can you restate that? Whatever works for the teams. that's probably the priority rather than for us.
Yes, so are we allowed to verbally ask POIs? Because we were told not to do that during the speech just now. Just want to clarify.
Malaysia, are you saying that you would like the teams to just put POI on a piece of paper? Is that what you're saying? Okay, next time state it at the start of the round. And for China, would you rather they verbalize or put up a piece of paper?
Then let's just do paper as well then, just to make it easier to manage.
Okay, fantastic. All right, thank you.
Yep. Sorry for delay for the clarification. Can I check if my audio is okay? I'm gonna mute it. When Team Malaysia just emphasizes how you are the one who alienates people, that doesn't substitute for analysis or a denial of how the status quo works. The status quo is, in a major party system, Fox News is so loyal to the Republican Party that they have no problem calling any Democratic candidate a witch or crooked. The status quo is, Joe Biden isn't a candidate that speaks to the heart of any people on the ground or the most crucial and urgent timely issues that we must address. He's simply an agreeable candidate because the Democratic Party doesn't care as much to be the best candidate to pass the policies as much as not lose grasp of their existing big tent. The thing is, when the political party's goal of expanding across the political spectrum is contradictory to what we want in a political candidate, they've already met the criteria of violating the basic principle of democracy and therefore warrants a ban. Before the questions I want to answer in my speech, a few clarifications. Firstly, we urge Team Malaysia to listen to the model that my proposition speaker gave to you. She did not say that we have one round of elections and if you get 77% of the vote, you can automatically get elected. We said you have to have a majority vote. So how does that happen? It happens through a system of alternative voting, which means you rank the preference of all the candidates. And if the preference that you put as first is a candidate on the bottom, then we take your vote and give it to the second preference candidate on the list. We continue this process until there are two candidates left and one person has over 50% of the vote, a super majority. They need to listen to this model that's adopted in European countries and supported by liberal Democrats before accusing us of not representing people in a democracy. But secondly, they want to support a multi-party system, but they need to engage how multi-party systems rolls out in the status quo. In a multi-party system, big parties still emerge in the power dynamics throughout the centuries. In the UK, yes, it's a multi-party system with things like the Sinn Féin and things like the Liberal Democrats, but the major parties are the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, generally belonging to two power dynamics, and people think if they don't vote for one of the two big parties, they will not have a meaningful vote. That's the status quo they have to disprove, or else they must engage. Lastly, social movements and labor unions are different than political parties because political parties do not have power to dictate who are the ones running on the platform for the particular ballot, as my first speaker has vocalized. Therefore, we can also support labor unions collectively bargaining, starting lawsuits. That's not something they can uniquely defend on their side. With that said, I want to answer three questions in my speech. Firstly, why political parties stunt representation? Secondly, why political parties don't bring about timely and effective change? And lastly, a new substantive material on why they further populism and therefore target the most vulnerable in society. Firstly, on why political parties stunt representation. Because the only principal argument we got from them is that you stunt the representation of people because you don't allow them to group together and therefore represent their interests. But the premise of that argument is that political parties have to accurately represent your interests, or else it's not people pulling their identity together and getting represented. It's just you imposing a super simplified and not accurate type of identity onto other people. So why is that premise wrong? One, because a party's goal is contradictory to accurate representation. A party wants to expand. The more voters they have, the more power they get. The more long-running their party can be, because the more stable the voter base is. But when you have a larger tent, you have to sacrifice the authenticity of the voice of a particular party just to dilute the platform a little bit so that it's more agreeable across a larger part of the spectrum. That's why originally Democrats don't care about, they were willing to vocalize issues for the minorities like the immigrants, but now they run moderate candidates populace of Clinton and Joe Biden who just want to be agreeable because that's the easiest way to not take a risk and lose people who are voting for you. But two, when you opt into identity, you opt into so many issues in the status quo as a Republican. As my partner said, you will also have to support that almost Christian view of life if you want to support a small government, politics, and economic policies. They need to justify to you why pushing all these identities onto someone once they opt to support a party is justified. That's not accurate representation. Rather, if you pick one out of the 30 choices of individual candidates and you can feel free to change at any time, that's more accurate representation where you pull together your political forces. But then they talked about lending platforms and they treat it as a huge attack. But the problem is we believe it's going to be way more better represented even if we lend platforms on our side. One, if you're one of within 30 candidates and you set like your agenda to say we just want to focus on gun limitations and that's what sets me apart from the 30 candidates, I'm not going to compromise on this issue and land on my platform because I lose my only edge, the only demographic that sets me apart from all the other 29 candidates in this race. Therefore, it's actually unlikely that you'll lend out your platform because the importance of keeping yourself different and therefore have a competitive edge. But two, if you lend out your platform, that means that this person is willing to authentically and fully take on what you were supporting in the first place because you don't want to see like in your voters' eyes as a fraud who just trades away their interest when it's in their political benefit. And therefore, if existing politicians on our side more authentically capture an issue, that's also a positive thing that we get on our side. The comparative is something they never told you. Even if we lend out platforms, we get more authentic preservation on their side. The second Sanders declares himself to be a Democrat, he's also subjected to pressure of the party. He has to have the general Democratic platform instead of just saying I want to push for universal health care because the Democrats don't want to be as radical, they're risk adverse. They don't want to be seen as the communist party and therefore they'll limit Sanders in what he can run and what he cannot, versus independents are not actually at the swing of that. Therefore, authentic preservation is only achieved on our side of the house. But we would argue the minorities' preservation of voice and representation is more important in this debate because the majority, they already have more votes. They're the rich people on Wall Street who will get their political opinions catered to no matter what. But only my partner told you why minorities have more authentic preservation because one, they're no longer taken for granted when you only have 3 or 2 choices. And right now in the status quo, Democrats believe you can't vote for the white supremacist Republican Party, and therefore I don't need to cater to you specifically. I can run my usual platform and like deprioritize racial issues, but still get a black vote. But on our side, the 30 candidates must each individually vie for the trust of these people, vie for the trust of minorities, and therefore they will push for more platforms and more policies and prioritize issues of minorities instead of saying you will take your vote for granted. These are reasons why we prioritize the representation of the most vulnerable. But then on to the second question, why political parties don't bring about change on their side. Because they say you just basically slander political opponents on our side as well. But a status quo is one in which people slander each other, especially because the media feels this toxicity that comes from the fact that I'm loyal to my party and therefore I can always slander the other side's case. But this changes on our side because the 30 candidates don't know who is their ally and who is their enemy down the line. They do not know in the future, in the next race, who can potentially help them in this race of 30 candidates because there's no longer a formal and firm alliance that you are in their party and I'm in ours and we always have the same interest. Therefore, they'll hold back their urges to call you a fraud or to call you out exactly because it's the more strategic thing to do as an independent candidate. With firm party lines, no one is afraid to piss off the other side, and therefore it is worse. But the 2 ways in which they don't bring about any change was never rebutted. One, when you cement the idea of us versus them, that is when you will know that that policy you cannot support because it takes away from the trust of your voters down the line if they see the Democrats as being efficient and you being useless. Therefore, you'll block Democrats' legislation even if it's a good one. But 2, this is the system where parties have more say than candidates because parties will go like, if you don't cooperate with us and vote on the party lines, next time I will not run you as a candidate on my ticket. I will not run you as a front runner. And all these power that parties have more candidates means that candidates are restricted to cross the bench to the other side and cooperate, even if they personally want to. But lastly, I want to talk about populism because no election on their side will be seen as a fresh start when it carries the stigma and the scarring events and scandals from previous Republicans or previous Democrats like Clinton and Reagan and Nixon, all their scandals. This is exactly what the hatred against the establishment builds up. When you think that no one is really representing you clearly, when you think no one is really being efficient and bringing about changes, that is exactly when people like Trump and Boris Johnson can take advantage and hijack this anger and push their xenophobic, racist rhetoric that's the most easy to fuel anger and therefore gain more votes. They're subjugating the minorities to populism's hatred and therefore oppression on their side. On our side, new candidates and news cycles bring about new changes and therefore hope associated with the establishment, because there's no such thing as seeing it's always two parties, they're always useless, but rather every election cycle is new and therefore there's not as much anti-establishment rhetoric. On their side, the two-party system cements the us versus them mentality, whereas we want to give you more choices and more representation, proud to propose.
Hi, the speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 29 seconds. Can I just check that that was clear, the sound? It wasn't? Okay. I'm...
Maybe if you can screen share with
Yeah.
the timer.
I'm using my timer on a phone, but if I go like this, is this okay for you guys? All right, I'll do that. Sorry.
If the judges are all right, can we invite Op to continue the case for opposition?
Hi, am I audible? Great. Panel, let's be clear, because I think that side of proposition misunderstood the burdens from the very beginning of this debate, because it was never really our burden to have to defend a broken democracy in which everyone was mudslinging, everyone was broken, and there was no representation whatsoever. That was never the burden to begin with, right? Because we told you, for the very same reasons that if they are feasibly able to ban political parties, I'm assuming we can also improve our checks and balance systems. For example, if there's a problem with the Electoral Commission or college, we would be able to reform that. We would be able to even disband that. We could do things like ban the filibuster, which I'm assuming is feasible if they are able to ban literally all political parties on their side of the house. We're able to improve the separation of powers which currently exists. What does this mean, panel? There is no such thing as a perfect democracy. This debate is thus about what features are uniquely intrinsic and inalienable to the structure of a democracy, which I think we will prove to you within this speech, right? So firstly, that was what they failed to do, which is properly evaluate what the burdens were on both sides of the house. I'm going to be charitable and engage with their best case scenario. Let's talk about their model for a second. That they wanted to paint the world in which Trump existed, Obama existed, and there was lots of polarization. I'll firstly like to point out that WSDC rules we contend with the vast majority of instances, because this is not a debate solely about the United States. We would point to you that in the vast majority of contexts, the parties and democracies around the world are ones in which there are many parties. So in Germany, we have the Christian Democratic Party, we have the Conservative Party, we have the Progressive Party, we have the Reformist Party. The same is the case for Malaysia and other states. What then is the nuance here? If people are dissatisfied under their side of the house, there are other parties and independents can still run under our side of the house to provide a check and balance. What happens under their side of the house? They only allow for independence, which means that they strip the ability and the important structure away from individuals who are currently happy with the democratic system and currently happy being represented by Trump, currently happy being represented by Biden. That is the comparative, because we allow for choice and they strip that away. So that's just a clarification of their model and why it was insufficient of them to talk about representation. But let's talk about this unique, funky principle of representation they wanted to talk about. Because it seems to me that proposition thinks representation means being able to live up to every single ideal that you want. Because that's obviously not the case. Democracies are always about compromises. You will never be able to pass 100% a gay policy and a Christian policy under their side of the house. Which means that, what is their change mechanism? How do you get change? If everyone is so diverse in Congress, they're individually representing each state, how are they going to get the collectivization to pass policies? I think the very reason that there was no counter model to prove a roadmap to change when every single independent is so diverse in nature is the very reason they are unable to prove a change mechanism. We told you, furthermore, that when we POI, can the independents lend platforms and form coalitions? They said yes. And I think this is a direct concession and recognition that you need to be able to collectivize in order to pass policies, in order to get change. The last thing that we talked about is populism, because now parties want to alienate. Firstly, I do not understand why this is mutually exclusive to begin with, because to a large extent, if you still want to represent your constituency, you may still very well use populism as a way to gain power. I do not exactly see where the comparative is, but even on top of that, I think it's a mere assertion without much analysis. But what uniquely did they not respond to from Jerome? Because Jerome told you something important, that the ability to form political parties is integral to the democratic structure. Why? A, because individuals have a principled right to collectivize for the greater good and shared goals. The unique structure of a democracy is one that should allow you to collectivize in order to achieve goals and collectivize around things like climate change. That's exactly why we allow for workers and trades unions. That's exactly why we allow for protests, because we recognize that power comes from numbers, and your ability to streamline the process and not have a bunch of squabbling politicians and independents who are never able to pass policies is one that is a right that should be given to you in order to further your goals. We told you that the ability to collectivize and form political parties is integral to the functions of democracy, because compromise was unique to a democracy. They would never be able to get 100% what you want to get. That's why a political party is uniquely important, because it allows you to go beyond self-interest and be able to coalesce around broader goals. So on a comparative, maybe we don't get 100% representation, but at least we're able to pass policies on a net as compared to a world in which individuals all are beholden to selfish interests. But secondly, notice there was no engagement with this point from Jerome that you cripple the functionality of government and parliament. Why? Because you cripple the ability to form a functional and cohesive government at a point at which you do not have an ability to coalesce and have a coalition to form around in order to further your principles and goals. There's also less of a continuity of policies, because the moment at which an independent exits office, who is his successor? Is he going to uphold their principles? I do not think so. But he furthermore told you, look at the short-term incentive structures that currently exist under their side of the house. Because politicians and independents now do not have a broad banner upon which they have to uphold racial equality. They have to uphold things. So they are going to appeal to things like cash handouts and more short-term goals in order to appease the masses in the short term, which means that they do not get the long-term sustainability that political goals are beholden to, because parties have to abide by their manifestos. But before my exclusive argument, yes.
If collectivization is so important, then why should you collectivize with people who you don't agree with? Why can't you simply collectivize with a single candidate on specific policy issues that differ for each policy and different view?
So on your side of the house, if you still want to co-opt all these benefits of being able to collectivize, I think you accrue the very same harms that you wanted to talk about that are intrinsic to political parties. I do not see where the distinction lies. But on my exclusive argument, why does it eviscerate progress in the political arena? And I think this is quite important to understand the democratic structure, because at the end of the day, politics is a game of resources. In the status quo, individuals gain ideological backings by the Democratic or Republican Party and therefore succeed. So we see them through the rise of Rashid Tlaib Omar, Bernie Sanders, AOC, all these individuals who will be able to leverage off the success and principles of the Democratic Party to then be able to further their grassroots and ability to collectivize. What happens under their side of the house is, because everything is independent, the rich are always the ones who win out. It is always the rich individuals who fund the campaigns and thereby are the ones who succeed. Therefore, I do not see how exactly you are going to get the sorts of individuals that are progressive on the ground, which the Democratic parties and political parties are currently able to help, helping fringe candidates rise, because there is now a platform to leverage off and therefore get resources from a large pool that political parties provide. Now, when you leave it to independents to decide the fate for themselves, it is always those who are always attached to richer individuals who are the ones who win out. Individuals who do not necessarily have to cater to the masses, I think that's harmful. But we also told you
that character assassination is currently prevalent. So under outside of house, there may be mudslinging. I'm not going to contest with that. But you still have an ideological backing and a broad-based coalition of Democrats to back you up and give you legitimacy. Under your side of the house, mudslinging is particularly pernicious because you are literally left on your own to fend for yourselves. It happens far worse in a world in which you have no check and balance mechanism to neutralize for the sorts of toxic narratives that you have. You exacerbate all those harms. At the end of the day, panel, what we need to recognize is that no democracy is perfect, but it is about the inalienable structures that we want within our democracy. That's why we win. We're so proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 25 seconds. Was that better? All right, thank you.
If the judges are ready, we can welcome third proposition to continue the case for prompt.
All right, does this sound work for everyone? What we needed from opposition was a comprehensive account of why it is okay to selectively ignore the nuanced views of millions of people as a sacrifice for politically homogeneous parties who carry one party line agendas, which promote cohesion, but only to the extent that it prescribes to one ideal rather than a multiplicity of views that are ever changing on our side of the house. But what we never got from them was an explanation for why these parties, who are meant to help people in the first place, would ever have an incentive to cater to groups of people who meant nothing to the electability of people like Biden because they were too small of a voting bloc. Our stance was that when you have a land as politically diverse as the vast majority of states around the world, party lines tend to socially segregate groups of people into supporting static policies they would not otherwise want. It is the reason why, although many politicians and people within the GOP recognize the pressing concerns of climate change, they are unlikely to push forward environmentally liberal policies because of the strict dichotomy created by different parties. But that changes when politicians are now able to cater to a wider and more diverse group of voters that is ever changing rather than sticking to these political lines, thereby increasing the quality as well as the quantity of political engagement in a way that transcends the dichotomy of the party. I want to talk about two things in this speech. Number one, on political engagement and polarization, and second of all, on the functionality of government policies. Before I go on, though, I'll take a point. Yeah.
So Joe Biden still has to cater to minorities because if not, these people can still abstain from voting and potentially not turn out in the vote. That is an incentive to cater to all minorities.
Let's be honest, right? Democrats don't actually do that. They say that they're going to cater in the name of minorities, and they just assume that minorities will vote for them. It's the reason why Hillary Clinton lost the vote in the first place, right? Because she tried so hard for this. So although they somewhat recognize this, like you're nodding right now, the fact of the matter is the politicians don't care. Like, if you're able to name me 2 or 3 policies that Biden actually uses to care about the poor, I'll give you this point. But the fact of the matter is, you can't. I want to make one important clarification before anything else. On the idea that there are lending platforms on our side, so therefore there are still parties here. First of all, if we assume that to be true, let's be honest, there's no debate because it's symmetric. But second of all, it's not true. You are still unlikely to get political lines because in the long run, candidates have more of an incentive to open to other diverse ranges of candidates, right? That is, for example, if you're an independent candidate right now and you work with someone, right, and you work with someone, they are now able to work with another individual another day in the event in which they change their policy because they don't need to conform to the strict regimen of only working with a select few people. But second of all, there are own reasons as to why the political establishment is good, i.e., for example, the existence of resources is simply a reason why this is something that is not true. So no, it is untrue that you somehow get parties on our side simply because of things like lending platforms. First then, on political engagement and polarization. We said the problem of the status quo is party lines compartmentalize different voter groups in a way that degrades nuanced views. Not only was this a principal injustice because it is unrepresentative of their views, but it also means that you are unlikely to cater to the vast majority of politicians and beliefs out there. The solution, therefore, is that when you have voters that cater to a variety of politicians, you are far more likely to address this problem. They have 2 responses. Number 1, at least we give some people what they want. And 2, now the population has 9% of the vote going to leaders who are now ruling over the nation. The first thing that we would say to this is that we already met this problem out insofar as we had a system by which you could vote for multiple politicians in on a ranking basis. But second of all, Notice how this rebuttal only works when we're talking about presidentials, prime ministers, and electable leaders. No, thank you. What about more representative senators, congressmen, and parliamentary members, right? For those groups of people, it is still okay for us to only give them 2% or 3% of the vote. The point is, when they no longer cater to the DNC or the GOP, or like the Liberal Party, or like the Liberal and Labour Party, what that means, therefore, is that they're able to expand their voter base towards another group of people that they actually want to support, but are not able to because they care about the establishment. This means, therefore, that you change the language by which politics is done in a manner that benefits the individuals on our side of the House. But third of all, notice that a major assumption coming from the opposition bench is the idea that when you vote for a party, that automatically means you love them. We told you that this was untrue because people are more than a blank state. I can be a Christian but still be pro-choice. I can be a liberal and support right state economics, right? The point to be made here is that when you force this dichotomy, all that choice is ruined, and therefore you were never actually able to get popular support on their side, so they lose by their own metric. So even if you claim that you have 50% of the vote on your side, it's not actually true. They said, oh, but other parties exist, so you can always switch. But independents now take power of choice away from those that care about Trump. But you know what I think limits choice the most? When you don't have a politician to cater to your beliefs in the first place, because they're constantly thinking about those party lines. Trump will always have people who support him to some relative success. The question is whether or not other Republicans who don't support Trump must vote for him because they are Republican and presumably on their side, nothing else. Their substantive here was on the point of representation. The political parties should be allowed for the collectivization of the greater good. The first thing we said is that this doesn't work insofar as there's a trade-off when you alienate groups of people by supporting one-line stances. But second of all, notice how you discourage people to join political parties in the first place, because those that don't want to join are probably don't want to because they don't want to support this kind of collectivization, because they do have nuanced views. But third of all, when you refuse to allow single stance voters from entering your base because you constantly support one line of logic rather than anything else, that is when you are less likely to have a proper kind of representation. So you fail on your own principle. On our side, coalitions are always fluid, meaning therefore independents are able to work together in ways that help promote the kinds of policies they support, but they do so in a way that transcends political boundaries that are constantly stagnant. So we still have cooperation, just without the kind of polarization on their side of the House. What was their response to this? You don't want to work with other politicians. The first thing to note here is that there is a direct incentive for polarization when you constantly have parties. Why? Because the GOP defines itself as everything that DNC is not. Let's be honest, right? People can support the GOP, but also care about climate change. But the dichotomy on their side means you can never support those two things at the same time, further blocking things like social justice efforts, not because people don't believe in them, but because of the benefits of the establishment. On our side, however, when you have independents who are more likely to care about the long run, because that is what, in fact, what their own voters care about. For example, the rising youth and the idea that climate change is going to affect the children of my people, and therefore I don't want to vote along the original party lines. That is when you have more of an incentive to get rid of that kind of stagnant nature and vote for the kind of progressive stuff on our side of the House. Before moving on to functionality, the last thing I want to discuss is their extension on the wealthy independents getting a lot of power. The first thing I want to note here is that at best this is symmetric insofar as the DNC on their side of the House still helps people like Biden over other candidates like Yang. Therefore, they cannot simply claim that rich people are suddenly gone on their side of the House. But second of all, I would say that you are just going to get far more people, like far more younger and poor candidates going in, given that you have social progressive movements that want to give these people more representation. It's the reason why AOC is in power, not because she had a lot of money, but because of the fact that poor people liked her. Second of all, on functionality and improving policies. They said there's continuity in their political agendas because you can have different kinds of parties who are always in power. The problem here is that when different parties are so polarized, it is difficult for you to ever have continuity in government. So when Obama makes Obamacare and Trump comes to power, the first thing he does is remove Obamacare, because no matter what it is, no matter how good it is, you always define yourself as being oppositional to that. But second of all, notice that they are never able to mediate the worst excesses of people like Trump. Because when those individuals do end up coming to power, the GOP and the kinds of political parties they support are suddenly forced to use that image of Trump as the representation of the party itself. Meaning you get worsened kinds of authoritarian or bad, pernicious, corrupt kinds of governments on their side. On proposition, we say that your vote should never be used as a chess piece in the game of politics, we propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 7 seconds.
Is it okay if we just hold it for a quick second? So sorry. Is that fine with the judges? Am I audible? We applaud side proposition that they picked the worst example of democracy and forced the debate to be centered around it. But moreover, provided no mechanism to actually resolve this insofar as they failed to prove how individuals will be elected. The first premise they gave us was that you will have rank voting. But not specifically, this system directly compromises each and every one of the arguments in this case because they wanted individuals to be completely represented in the way they should be. So you shouldn't be forced to compromise upon things in which you don't feel like you should. But at the point in which you have a voting of 1, 2, 3, at the point in which your first choice candidate is the most representative one but doesn't get the representation from the vast majority of individuals, you are forced to make a compromise on side proposition in this debate. You are forced to deal with a world in which you are not able to be fully represented. So we argue as to why their form of democracy is inherently better. But most importantly, they tried to take this out by saying you can still form coalitions in third proposition, but in second proposition, the literal response to POI was that coalitions will not be formed because they structurally want to differentiate themselves in order to gain the vast majority of the vote. So we're extremely confused as to what kind of representation these individuals are going to get. Are they going to run a holistic platform of policies, or are they going to run on strawman policies to differentiate themselves from each other? We think that's the principal characterization that structurally failed them in this debate. I have 3 key questions in this speech. Firstly, on the principle of what democracy truly is. Second, who has more representative democracy? And finally, who has more effective democracy? On the first question, who has the principle of democracy in this debate? I think not the structural problem with that proposition. They assume democracy in the Asabi House is complete and absolute representation in a world in which it cannot be compromised, in a world in which it has to fulfill the very fundamental rights and of people and their fundamental ideals. I think this is structurally untrue. Insofar as they said, individuals can come to a compromise because structural goals can be conflicting in some instances. So, for example, not specifically that a benefit of welfare policies will structurally come at a disadvantage of the resources of the state, which these antithetical ideals are not ones in which you are able to structurally solve on the outside of the house as well. Which is why you have party politics within the status quo, not based upon random ideas about scapegoating minorities, but actually left versus right-wing policies and right-wing party politics that actually serve a benefit towards individuals and cater towards the specific nuances. When they said Biden was unrepresentative, we structurally questioned them why. If Biden, the literal analysis they gave us was that party politics expands its diverse base of voters in order to cater to more individuals, at the point which you concede, the very reason why they want to have a dilution of particular policies for the benefits of other policies, for example, like not providing completely universal healthcare like Sanders, but providing some level of subsidies towards individuals below the bottom line, there's a structural compromise that influences the entire population. So they're able to garner the vast majority of vote from the poor individuals as well as moderates who don't want to have so much state expenditure. We question them if that policy succeeded in getting them votes in the first place. How is that then not representative of democracy on our side of the house? We get a structural representation. But not specifically, their model knife their own characterization of what democracy ought to be. Because they wanted democracy to be complete representation. People shouldn't be forced to compromise their ideals for party politics, but they are still forced to choose based upon who these people are and forced to choose based upon why one specific individual is better than the other. We think that still is a compromise with their nuanced ideals of what democracy ought to be. They don't have to claim the principle. Second, who has more representative democracy? They say candidates are non-representative because they are forced to be separated by party lines. I think insofar as they were unable to substantiate what party lines these was, they structurally failed this debate. Not specifically, the Republican Party can never support climate change because their principled right was to support things like more welfare, to support things like less government expenditure, and climate change in the Green New Deal expands a lot of expenditure in the very first place. So it isn't something which individuals can simply come to a compromise for. We think that uniquely something we get on our side of the house. But second, the argument that candidates are unable to infiltrate this individual, like candidates will never be progressive within the Democratic Party, for example. Note specifically, this is unnuanced towards the current status quo. Note that AOC came into power by riding off the Democratic platform. Insofar as she rode off that platform, she was able to send her new liberal ideals into the Democratic Party to incorporate new first world things. So for example, before this, the talks about climate change were never existent in politics at all. But the moment in which AOC came into power as a Congress representative, she was able to shift democratic parties in order to incorporate a level of discussion upon those policies as well. So it's not necessarily a world where you don't get policies at all, but you get a compromise of those policies and a balance based upon which is more palatable towards voters within the status quo. We think that's why we get more representative candidates as a whole. The second thing they say is that you're forced to structurally discriminate against particular others when you have primary elections. No, this isn't structurally a bad thing. They have primary elections that are still voted in by individuals, and not specifically in a lot of cases, people see their primary elections towards other representatives and other candidates. This looks like Bernie Sanders stepping down in order for Joe Biden to represent the Democratic Party. It was a consensual choice, and a choice that was for the betterment of the party politics and was the betterment for the people. We have no idea why that's structurally bad. Before I move on to the POI.
The difference is, Trump has to get rid of Obamacare even if it's popular, because anything Democratic left standing is harmful. The independent will keep a popular policy from the predecessor because it only makes him more popular in the eyes of future voters. Even if it's someone different, they'll keep the popular policy.
Not specifically, Obamacare was a failing version in and of itself, right? It was expenditure was extremely high, and it wasn't structurally because it was Obama's issue. But even if it was, I think Trump was one of the worst examples in this debate for what a Republican candidate can be. Not with the rise of populism that's only exclusive to the United States, we think it's an unfair characterization of what right-wing politics can actually be. A better characterization would probably be in Germany, where they did have compromises upon some healthcare and welfare benefits, but reduced expenditure to only allow for some individuals below the bottom line to receive those benefits. We think it's the kind of policy you uniquely get under functional democracy. Final thing then, on who has more effective democracy as a whole. No, it's insufficient for proposition to argue why policies on the environment are unable to be passed in the status quo and argue why structural harms exist within their world without providing an actual roadmap and mechanism to resolving all these issues in the very first place. We question them. If they want to actually resolve things like climate change, not specifically, their ideas are extremely fringe in nature within the status quo. They wanted to cater to minority rights in and of themselves. How would a single individual believe that it's structurally logical for him to win an election by writing specifically of one group of voter base? We think that's structurally untrue, and your ability to cater to these specific individuals is when it's also highly diminished on your side of the house. We don't think you get this benefit at all. But second, in order for you to pass policies within Congress and pass policies within the Senate, it is structurally impossible for you to have any beneficial reform. At the point at which you recognize that you're an independent individual that wants to distinguish yourself as much as possible, we structurally question your incentive structure as a person. Why would you then want to compromise with other individuals if it means ceding legitimacy of you as a candidate to a person who has a better policy? You structurally wanted to differentiate yourself, right? So when it comes to passing policies in Congress or in the Senate, you're unable to agree upon things which are genuinely quite beneficial towards the vast majority of society. But finally, we think even within party politics, this isn't something that's impossible to resolve in the first place. More specifically, that the very reason why Democrats will want to cater towards minority individuals and the minority groups in the first place was precisely because Hillary Clinton lost the previous election. They recognize they cannot simply make blank promises because that will lose them the next election. That structural reason means Joe Biden right now supports things like an active defunding of the police and a level of healthcare benefits for individuals below the bottom line. We think these two reasons allow for party politics to actually mediate themselves and gain the best interests for the general population as a whole. More specifically, this debate isn't about achieving the perfect rule of democracy where every single problem can be solved. What opposition tells you is that you need the unique ability to collectivize, to form compromises, so a vast majority of good policies can be passed on a moderate level that can galvanize a moderate amount of voter bases for these things. Only on such opposition, where you allow parties to exist, allow a collectivization to exist, you allow for democracy to be functional. Very proud of your post.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 22 seconds.
If the judges are ready, we can have opposition reply to close the case for opposition.
Hi, am I audible? Okay, great. Panel, I'll be very clear in this reply speech and tell you why we win on the three burdens that we want to talk about. First, the principle. Second, functions of government. And third, about what this does to the political arena. But I just want to point out two things to begin with. Firstly, that this debate does not take place in the United States. That they cannot cherry pick the worst of circumstances to be the characterization of this debate. We pointed to you, in the vast majority of contexts, we have a multi-party system in which 7 or 8 parties are the ones that are contesting, which means that the vast majority of analysis they wanted to talk about only operates under our very worst case scenario. But the second thing I want to talk about is about what the burdens are in this debate, because it wasn't sufficient of them to say that the current political arena was failing. For the reasons I told you in my speech, that if they are able to literally ban all political arenas, that also means that if there is a failing Congress, we can ban the filibuster. If there is a problem with the Electoral College, we feasibly also can do the reform or disband that, as Democrats suggest. What that then means is that we need to compare charitably what is intrinsic to the democratic system and why is party politics, which they did not prove, intrinsically harmful as compared to cherry-picking certain instances in which there are. And we told you furthermore that we have check and balance mechanisms, but on top of that, why principally and feasibly this is the solution. Firstly, on the principle, they had a funky principle about the principle of representation using rank voting. We firstly pointed out to you that rank voting in and of itself was in contention with the principle, because rank voting relies on compromise and relies on your ability to still rank your candidates in a way that would compromise your ideals. But secondly, we told you democracy is not about 100% representation. Because if you really do support gays and Christians and want to go into Senate trying to pass a policy, you would not be able to do so no matter how hard you believe that is true. That is why we told you it was a moral hazard for the state to intervene in this instance, when there should be a principle to have the ability to form political parties to streamline this democratic process, which is then integral to our principles of being able to achieve the most change. Secondly, on the functions of government, right? Because we firstly told you that they already rely on a fictitious narrative in which true representation was the way to go. We questioned them. What is the change mechanism at the point at which their contextualization was that individuals were vastly diverse? What is the change mechanism to making 222 congressmen agree on the same policy at the point at which they have diverse set of ideologies? How are they going to agree on the gay principles you wanted to talk about? How are they going to agree on the Christian principles they want to talk about? But even if they do and can compromise, that means that they also violate their principle of representation and representation to the fullest extent. We told you on the outside of the house, you crippled democratic functionality because you were unable to form that compromise. Where currently, the reason why political parties are so important is because they get to facilitate those compromises. They get to facilitate and give legitimacy to being able to pass policies. So even if we do not get complete representation, we get the most amount of change and compromise, which we think still ensures that policies are passed. Maybe we don't get the Green New Deal, we get some sort of environmental regulation. Lastly, on the political arena, we told you why you uniquely eviscerate progress, because at the end of the day, politics is a question of resources. When now individuals, only rich individuals and powerful individuals are the ones who are able to succeed, because uniquely all the funding, all the campaigning must rely on independent candidates who are unable to leverage off the success that current fringe candidates are able to do. Individuals like Rashid Tlaib Omar, who receive hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to beat out an incumbent Republican. They say, well, you will always support the richer candidate. Is that true? Is it really true that Joe Biden is richer than Michael Bloomberg? I don't think so. They probably support the candidate who has the strongest principle backing. We gave you multiple examples in which candidates were able to succeed. But lastly, we told you about character assassination, and where currently your party is a bounce back and gives you legitimacy to continue in the field, you eviscerate that ability to do so. They overall toxicize the political arena, which is why at the end of the day, side with opposition.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 20 seconds.
To conclude the debate, we invite proposition reply.
Sorry, we're actually going to switch device because just now when I was giving the speech, the screen completely froze, and my partners just let me know that there were actually POIs offered. So even though there are no POIs, just for stability reasons, we'll switch a device. And apologies that I didn't notice during this speech that it was frozen as I was delivering. sorry for the inconvenience during this speech as well. Policy change itself is a neutral thing unless they can prove to you why the candidates elected on their side will be better candidates. Because they can't just brush off Trump as an extreme case. When populism is rising in Italy in the five-star movement, when it's rising in France under Le Pen, when it's rising in Britain under Boris Johnson and all these other cases, they cannot cherry pick an example and tell you their comparative is better when there was no analysis to substantiate that claim. There are three strategic mistakes that I continuously made down the bench that we want to point out first. One, they showed you no comparative. They can tell you why there's no cooperation on our side, but they never showed you why in the partisan deadlock in the status quo that they cannot just lie to you and deny there's suddenly going to be cooperation when there hasn't been. Two, in the entire debate, they ignore our knowledge and just cherry pick our examples by saying, well, Obamacare is bad, but they never really answered the logic behind the POI or to actually engage the fact that you wouldn't let something that your opponents build get kept, even if it's a good thing. Only independents will do that. And three, a lot of the benefits they talk about are entirely parallel. When it's about banning rich people from spending too much money in their campaigns, when it's about if people really like Biden as they characterize, he can still run our side even as an independent on the candidate sheet. There's no unique benefits from all these argumentations that they wasted time on. But moving on to the crux of the debate, I want to answer three questions. The first question I want to answer is on their grounds. Who passed more policies? And we believe we even win this debate. Because the question is that they always question us for our change mechanism when they ignore two things. One, they never proved to you the status quo is good. And two, they never even engaged the change mechanism that my first and second speaker repeatedly gave to you. What did we tell you? We told you cooperation is more fluid. Because on your side, you can only cooperate with a fellow Republican or Democrat without your voter base thinking you have betrayed us and therefore will never vote for you again. On our side, it is strategic to actually ally up with another independent because you're a fellow independent in the 30 pool and therefore it's strategic for you to find another person and accurately represent both issues and gain more votes. It is that you'll become popular if you're not seen as the destroyer candidate where you just destroy everyone predecessors who have built even if it's in your favor. But rather, even if you have your differences, the fact that you can keep good policies also will make me more popular down the line. But that's different because a Republican, even if a healthcare policy is good, even if social security policy is good, if he leaves the Democratic bill standing, his fellow Republicans will feel betrayed. So what cooperation do we uniquely gain? We gain a small government moderate Republican who doesn't really care about implementing more welfare programs, who want to also protect the environment, but on their side, this person can't because the Republican Party will choose to never put him on the candidate sheet again if they betray the party lines all through the extremist control. But moreover, they never proved to you why they can tackle the politicization that's inherent to a party system, about how media will feel toxicity, no response, about how a cemented us versus them type of party division mindset will always mean you underestimate and undermine who comes before. Even if you ban the filibuster, there's no incentive analysis as to why you won't vote with party lines. You will vote for the other side, even if it means your party gets entirely mad at you. Banning the filibuster doesn't change the incentives and mindset that we told you about. But secondly, we want to tell you why passing policies itself is not good. If the politician that gets into office is like Boris Johnson and Trump, then you pass bad policies like the Muslim ban, meaning that impact is not an automatically value good thing. Even in the UK, in their best example, they never engaged why populism wouldn't rise as our second speaker extension. That Boris Johnson rose. That Boris Johnson is leveraging a lot of hatred and xenophobic sentiment and not taking in refugees. Those are the harm that they have to deal with. But also, we told you why they will always ignore the minority people. Because even if lots of people go vote for Clinton as their only line of defense, they're only voting for Clinton because they're scared of Trump getting into power. It doesn't mean Clinton will actually put in any effort to help the Black individuals, meaning there's no incentive to actually pass policies where we help minorities. But even if we lose every single argument that I just talked about, we still win because we still get better representation by our model. Even in the debates, if these people don't have to deliver speeches screened by the Democratic Party and make sure it's not too disagreeable, it's not too extremist, I can push forward my radical changes to the healthcare system. I can push forward the radical racial programs that I want to implement that is more minorities heard on the stage of that debate, that is more minorities who gain a sense of empowerment when they can rally off that speech and build momentum for their own social movement. Even with those words that are not filtered, we gain more traction, which is why we're so proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 27 seconds.
Thank you, everyone, for that debate. Can we ask everyone to wait patiently in this room as the judges deliberate? They'll be sent to a breakout room and they'll return to this room at the end of their deliberation to deliver the results. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, judges.
Thank you so much for the debate, Team China.
Thank you, Team China.
Thank you to Team Malaysia as well, and thank you for judges for judging this debate. Best of luck to both sides.